Blog 21, In Search of a New Perspective. In the last blogs we discussed how the human tendency to experience ourselves as connected to one another can be disrupted by traumatic memories, and how this disruption leads to a distorted view that legitimizes violence based on fear. We also observed how this view has become established within European history and has enabled oppression, terror, and wars. In order to create a condition for peaceful coexistence in the future, it is therefore not only necessary to promote the processing of traumatic experiences, but also to recognize and revise the destructive effect of this distorted view. The fact that a fundamental change of perspective is urgently needed is also made clear by the statements of literary scholars Peter Hajdu and Vincent Pecora. Hajdu calls for an ethics in which the other is encountered and recognized in its presence in a way that calls for unlimited responsibility that could be, quote, the ironclad guarantee for non-recurrence of the Holocaust. End of quote. Pecora demands that the Holocaust needs to be understood in its historical context to provoke a change in perspective that prevents further violence. He writes in 1992, if the specific and terrifying suffering endured by the victims of Nazi persecution is not mobilized to remind the West of the barbarity folded into even its most admirable traditions, but instead serves to obscure it and perhaps to foster surreptitiously a smug sense of political complacency and assuredness, then that suffering will end up serving barbaric purposes all over again. Since the fear-based perspective that classifies some people as others and legitimizes violence against these others forms the basis of our Western society and influences our thinking on many levels, a fundamental rethinking is required. Language as an experience of our way of thinking can play an important role in this process, and a revision of our communication behavior can be the key to change. The American psychologist Marshall Rosenberg developed an alternative communication model with regard to speaking and listening that can enable such a change. Rosenberg identified a loss of reference in communications in which speakers trigger feelings such as fear, guilt and shame in their listeners through moral judgments and static generalizations. He called this type of communication alienating from life, and proposed a model that promotes a connection to oneself and others. He called this model nonviolent communication, NVC. Rosenberg believed that giving and receiving compassionately is an essential part of human nature, and that a loss of connection with ourselves and others is caused by what he called destructive cultural learning. Rosenberg's model of nonviolent communication reverses this destructive learning by teaching us to observe without judgment or evaluation. By promoting a non-judgmental experience, empathy towards oneself and others becomes possible. Feelings and needs can be clearly identified and communicated, creating situations in which everyone's needs can be acknowledged, respected, and considered. Rosenberg writes in 2003, NVC guides us in reframing how to express ourselves and hear others. Instead of habitual automatic reactions, our words become conscious responses based firmly on awareness of what we are perceiving, feeling, and wanting, while simultaneously paying others a respectful and empathetic attention. Rosenberg believed that life-alienating communication reflects and reinforces hierarchical social structures, and that communication that restores connection to oneself and others can also contribute to social change. He writes in 2003, life-alienating communication both stems from and supports hierarchical and domination societies, where large populations are controlled by small numbers of individuals to those individuals' own benefit. The language of wrongness, should and have to, is perfectly suited to this purpose. The more people are trained to think in terms of moralistic judgments that imply wrongness and badness, the more they are trained to look outside themselves, to outside authorities, for the definition of what constitutes right, wrong, good and bad. When we are in contact with our feelings and needs, we humans no longer make good slaves and underlings. What Rosenberg calls destructive cultural learning is learning that is based on a perspective that judges, such as between people who were born to rule and those who were born to be ruled. The separation through judgment blocks the feeling of social connectedness and legitimizes violence. In order to break free from this violence, which begins in thought and speech, one must recognize this connection and strive to learn a new way of thinking and speaking in which people are never judged or condemned. We have seen that due to the synaptic plasticity, we are constantly changing and can therefore be present in the here and now in the flow of an ever-changing environment. Any judgment, whether positive or negative, would impair the state of being able to constantly change and can therefore be understood as non-life affirming and promoting violence. The philosopher Rosi Predotti speaks of being in becoming rather than to be, to make this important distinction clear. Violence therefore begins where we judge ourselves or others and ends in a hierarchical social structure characterized by oppression and violence. Rosenberg writes in 2003, destructive cultural learning is so ingrained in our lives that we are no longer conscious of it. In the same way, pain engendered by damaging cultural conditioning is such an integral part of our lives that we can no longer distinguish its presence. It takes tremendous energy and awareness to recognize this destructive learning and to transform it into thoughts and behaviors that are of value and of service to life. NVC is a very concrete and multi-layered learning system that can enable the necessary change of perspective that provides the basis for a truly peaceful coexistence. There will always be experiences that are perceived as life-threatening and leave behind traumatic memories, as well as experiences that negatively affect social and societal relationships. The important thing is that a loss of relationship, regardless of the level at which it occurs, is recognized, acknowledged, and processed in a way that the lost emotional connections can be rebuilt. At the same time, we must strive for a fear-free perspective in which the other is recognized and valued as a mirror of the one's own self, and the state of being connected to one another is seen as the only possible basis for a sustainable way of life. the philosopher Rosi Predotti talks about an ethics of sustainable affirmative relations, which facilitates the recognition and renegotiation of our being in this together, leading towards, quote, the construction of communities where the notion of transience, of passing, is acknowledged in a sober secular manner that binds us to the multiple others in a vital web of interrelations.